And so with that, we'll turn it over to our keynote. I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Kaylin Carey, who is a professor of biological science at Virginia Tech. She received her bachelor's degree in environmental biology from Dartmouth College, was a Fulbright Fellow at Uppsala University in Sweden, and received her PhD in ecology from Cornell University. She completed a postdoc at the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has been a professor at Virginia Tech since 2013. During the past 10 years, she has worked closely with the Western Virginia Water Authority to examine how different engineering and monitoring strategies can be used to build water quality resilience. Kaylin is with us today to talk about her research integrating sensor networks and simulation modeling to forecast drinking water quality. Welcome, Dr. Carey.
Thank you. Is this good for sound? Does that work?
Adjustments as you talk.
Can you hear me in the back? Does that work? Awesome. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here this afternoon, to be your keynote. I'm so excited to be here and to share with you work that my lab is leading on real-term, iterative ecological forecasting, which I think has vast potential for improving our understanding of how lakes and reservoir ecosystems function. But before I begin, I want to give a special thanks to my grad students, to my wondergrads, my postdocs, and my entire team and faculty colleagues who contributed the vast majority of data that I'll be presenting to you today, and have contributed countless hours and ideas and feedback, and made the work that I'm presenting to you far better than anything I could have done solo. My lab at Virginia Tech integrates questions, approaches, and tools from ecosystem science and data science to understand how human activities are altering freshwater ecosystems, and in turn, how changing water quality feeds back to alter human decision making. And the overarching motivation for this work is that we are experiencing unprecedented variability in our lakes and reservoirs around the globe. As a result of climate and land use change, we are seeing an increase in toxic algal and cyanobacterial scums, as you can see here in this photo. We have increasing amounts of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and metals leaving the sediments of lakes and reservoirs and going into the water column, creating taste, odor, and staining problems, as you can see here, and many other forms of impairment that makes our lake water undrinkable. And this increased variability is putting enormous strain on water utilities, which are trying to provision drinking water for their communities. So every day, every hour, managers are forced to answer many different questions. This increased variability is putting a huge strain on these managers that every hour need to answer questions like, which depths should I extract water from a reservoir or a lake for treatment? Which chemicals and how much should we add in every single step of the treatment process from the reservoir right here to your tap? And as lake water becomes more and more unpredictable in quality, managers are forced to add more and more chemicals at every single step of the treatment process because they simply don't know what to be expecting is coming in from the reservoir. And so the question that my team is really interested in asking is, what if, rather than having to respond to impairment in lake water quality after it's already started, what if managers had advance notice that water quality impairment was going to happen in the future, thus giving them the opportunity to preemptively make changes to adapt or to mitigate that event before it even started? Our team at Virginia Tech is tackling this ambitious effort by creating some of the world's first water temperature forecasts for lakes and reservoirs. We've started with the Roanoke reservoirs, and we are now scaling to lakes and reservoirs across the US. We're specifically starting with water temperature for forecasts because it matters a lot for reservoirs in terms of knowing which depth to extract for drinking as well as for downstream dam releases. And because water temperature is a master variable that controls dissolved oxygen concentrations, water chemistry, as well as how much algae is in your lake. So similar to how every day you might make a decision based off of your weather forecast, such as, what should I wear today? Should I go for that run after work? We are asking, can we generate forecasts that could be integrated into management decision making for lake water quality? Unfortunately, water temperature is complicated. And it also is variable, both over depth within a lake from the surface to the sediments, as well as over time. These are data of water temperature collected in a Roanoke reservoir over a year, from on the x-axis January to December, and on the y-axis is depth from the surface of the lake down to the sediments. The color refers to the water temperature: cold, 0 degrees Celsius, warm, 25 degrees. At the beginning of the year, there wasn't any ice on this reservoir, so it was mixed, meaning that there was the same water temperature from the surface down to the sediments and cold. As the air warmed, and as we start to go into the spring, the surface waters in the reservoir warmed as well, creating a stratification in which we have a warm surface layer and a cold bottom layer, where these two layers will remain separate throughout the summer until the onset of fall mixing, and after that onset happens, you'll keep mixing throughout the rest of the year. Now, that first day of mixing is a really special day in the lake year calendar. We call this fall turnover. And it's a really special day because throughout the summer, there is a large accumulation of carbon, nutrients, metals that are released from the sediments into the bottom waters in that cold bottom layer. Now, on the day of turnover, all of a sudden, all of that high carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus metals are mixed throughout the entire water column, from the top to the bottom. And so if you're a reservoir manager trying to decide which depth to pull from, there's no choice, but you're kind of stuck because the entire water column now has really high impairment. And in the reservoirs where I work in Roanoke, we have really, really high concentrations of iron. So on the day of fall turnover, the reservoir will literally turn red because there's so much iron that is within the water column. This right here is a grab sample taken from the surface of the lake the day before turnover in 2018. The bottle on the right was taken from a grab sample the day of fall turnover. So there's no way that the managers would have necessarily known that tomorrow was going to be turnover from just collecting daily samples. After all of that iron precipitates and oxidizes and settles to the bottom of the reservoir, we then get to have beautiful green, thick algal and cyanobacterial blooms because we also have a lot of phosphorus that gets mixed throughout the water column. So we get really high iron events, and then we get really high algal bloom conditions that usually last for about 2 weeks. And it's just impossible for the managers to keep up with all of this clogging that happens on their filters as well as in the treatment process. And usually at the beginning of fall turnover, the managers will just shut down the water treatment plant and be forced to extract drinking water from another reservoir. So the take home from this is that knowing in advance when fall turnover happens is really, really important from a water quality perspective for this system. So the team that I'm working with is asking 4 research questions. The first is, how well can we forecast water temperature, both at different times of year, stratified and mixed conditions, as well as at different depths from the surface to the bottom of the reservoir? Second, can we actually forecast the day of fall turnover? Can we actually predict early enough and have enough lead time that we could give that advance notice to the managers so that they could actually do something about it? If we give them the notification that turnover is going to happen tomorrow, that's probably too short for them to actually do something. But if we were able to tell them, for example, 4 or 5 days in advance, that could actually enable and change their decision making for management. Third, what are the sources of uncertainty in our forecasts? So because we are creating a forecasting system from scratch, we're trying to understand how best we can make the most accurate forecast possible. And so understanding what the sources of uncertainty are, whether it's our model structure, model parameters, our data that are going into our forecasts, is really important for improving the forecasting system overall. And fourth, can we use forecasting to learn about these ecosystems? And I say this specifically because I think there's something extremely compelling about this idea of real-time, near-term iterative forecasting. In a way, it is a fundamental test of the scientific method because we are making a forecast, which is a hypothesis about what tomorrow's conditions are going to be, and then we collect data tomorrow, and it confronts that hypothesis and is either supported or refuted, and then we do it again, over and over and over again. And just so I can kind of explain this and make sure everyone's on the same page, when I say real-time, near-term iterative forecasting, I'm going to kind of show you the iterative forecasting cycle. anytime you make a hypothesis about how the world works, you, in fact, have created a model. And so if I say, for example, that I have a hypothesis that algal conditions in a lake tomorrow are a function of algae today and the water temperature today, I have just created a model. A very simple model, but a model nonetheless. All right, now that I have my model in hand for that specific lake, I can go and look at maybe historical data. Maybe there's sensors, maybe there's historical manual observations. And I can use that historical data to fit my model, so to figure out what the parameters are in that very simple kind of y equals mx plus b model. Now, because I know what today's water temperature and today's algae concentrations are, I can actually predict what tomorrow's will be. So I have a prediction that's made. But a forecast isn't just a prediction, it's a prediction with specified uncertainty. And so I need to quantify the uncertainty in that prediction by going back to my model and doing some math and figuring out how much uncertainty is related to that prediction. And let's just say, pretend that my forecast for tomorrow's algae in a lake is that there's going to be 5 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll, plus or minus 1 microgram per liter of chlorophyll. All right, I have my prediction, I have uncertainty, I now have a forecast. Et voila. My forecast is generated. And in an ideal world, I would share that with managers, where that would be used for decision support, for giving them actionable information if they're trying to manage for algae. And now I wait. And so tomorrow comes, and because I have sensors out in that lake that are measuring algae in real time, I can then see how my forecast did. And let's say that the water algae concentrations were actually 5 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll. My forecast was nailed it, right? That's great. So now this becomes the initial conditions for tomorrow's forecast. But let's pretend that my observations are really far off from my forecast. Let's say that we actually measured that it was 10 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll. Well, this then provides a really valuable opportunity for going back and revisiting my model. Maybe I need to update my parameters. Maybe I need a new model. Maybe I need to think about phosphorus in the lake. This iterative learning in which I am making a forecast that's embedded in a hypothesis and comparing with data allows us to learn over time about the ecosystem, as well as yields more accurate forecasts into the future. We are using this iterative forecasting approach for generating water temperature forecasts for Falling Creek Reservoir, which I affectionately will refer to as FCR. FCR is a small drinking water reservoir. It's eutrophic. It's located outside of Roanoke, Virginia, and it's owned and operated by the Western Virginia Water Authority, which have been fabulous partners to work with in this project. At the time in which the reservoir was built in the late 1800s, the entire catchment was in agriculture. Most of those farms were abandoned, and it's now completely in deciduous forest in the catchment since the 1930s. FCR is a GLEON site, which stands for Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network, which means that we have deployed sensors throughout the reservoir, which are streaming data that we are sharing with colleagues around the world to study how lakes and reservoirs are changing due to climate. It's also important for me to acknowledge that FCR is located in the traditional Tutolo and Monacan lands. Now, I unfortunately can't take you all on a field trip to FCR, so I'm going to bring FCR to you and just show you a really quick drone flyover of the reservoir. And you can see some of my students that are out sampling right here. The take-home of you seeing this is, one, for you to see that we're in a completely deciduous forest, and it's quite a beautiful system. We have sensors deployed throughout the reservoir, monitoring water quality, a suite of different variables on the minute scale. And the last is that it's a beautiful, wonderful place to do science. At a high level, our team is streaming data wirelessly and securely from sensors in the field to the cloud every single day, where those data are being used to run ensemble probabilistic models generating water temperature forecasts. So similar to how you might get a forecast that there is a 50% chance of rain next Tuesday, we are developing forecasts where you might say, for example, that there is a 95% chance of a high iron event on Thursday. And I did not do this myself. It takes a village to make a forecasting system. So I worked very closely with computer scientists and engineers and modelers and environmental scientists and social scientists who are studying how managers, once they receive a forecast, actually might use that information. Because if we aren't making a forecast that is used, then there is no point in doing this at all. So we're at a monitoring conference, so I'm going to break down the components of this forecasting system for you, and I'm going to start with the sensors. So we have a lot of sensors throughout the reservoir. At the dam alone, we have water temperature sensors, or thermistors, every 1 meter from the surface all the way down to the sediments. We are monitoring dissolved oxygen at 1 meter from the surface, 1 meter above the sediments, and another sonde that's located in the mid-water column. I have an additional sonde that's 1 meter from the surface that's monitoring for algae, as chlorophyll A, organic matter, turbidity, and conductivity. We have pressure transducers at the bottom to measure changes that are happening in water level, as well as in the inflowing streams for a water budget to understand how much discharge is coming into the reservoir. All of these sensors are collecting data on the 10-minute scale, and then I have a meteorology station on the dam of the reservoir that's collecting data on the minute scale. All of these data follow a similar workflow, where all of the data are being pushed to data loggers that are located out in the field. These data loggers are connected to sensor gateways, or mini computers about the size of an iPhone, which push the data to the internet via Verizon cellular links approximately every 3 hours. Once online, those data are then entered via staging servers into online repositories, which we can access for automated modeling. This is all time-triggered cron jobs that are happening. I don't have a student that's doing this manually. This is all happening wirelessly, securely behind passwords and other secure data streams, and happening automated through the night. This is what it looks like on the ground, where we have sensors, lots of electrical instrumentation to keep this all going, lots of students and a full-time sensor technician behind the scenes who's keeping this kind of infrastructure for 4 reservoirs going. We use these data to run a lake ecosystem simulation model called GLM-AED, which stands for General Lake Model Aquatic Ecodynamics, which is an open source model which I helped develop with colleagues. And this model is used to simulate a whole suite of different water quality variables. The driver data for this model are meteorology, so what's the weather, as well as what's the hydrology of the inflowing streams into a lake or reservoir. From that driver data, we can then simulate both water temperatures at a whole range of depths, as well as physical mixing processes. We can also turn on or off additional complexity in the model by simulating water chemistry and plankton. I'm going to be focusing primarily on the physics today, but we'll mention and get to some of the biology and chemistry at the end. So just to talk you through what 1 day of our forecasting system workflow, what it looks like, which was developed by my colleague Quinn Thomas at Virginia Tech. So every few hours, model driver data, which is the hydrology, as well as the meteorology at the reservoir, are pushed to GitHub, which is our online repository. Once it's online, it's used to run the lake model, which is run every night at midnight for 1 24-hour period. This will then yield simulated model temperatures, so model predictions of what water temperature is. We can then compare those simulated or modeled temperatures with what actually was observed, because all of those water temperature sensors are also pushing data online. We can then compare the modeled versus the observed data and update the model using statistical techniques. In our case, we're using an ensemble common filter, which is an approach that allows us to adjust the model. So it'll update both the model states as well as the model parameters. So the model is constantly evolving over time based on current conditions. These updated model states will serve as the initial conditions for tomorrow's simulation, which we feed in a 35-day weather forecast from NOAA, which is used to generate out a 35-day simulation into the future. This is then archived online in our online repositories, so we can benchmark and see how we actually did, as well as an automated email that is sent to our manager colleagues at 7:30 a.m. every morning. And we specifically chose 7:30 a.m. because that's the time of a shift change at the water treatment plant. So this is an example of what one of those email visualizations look like. And I'll talk through this in just a second, but I want to note the really important kind of role that social science had in this. And that when we originally started this project, we did not start with this type of visualization. We actually started with this one, which is from the modelers on our team's perspective, this is really valuable for them. But when we gave that to our managers, they're like, no. And so this kind of co-design process, which took many months, involved us making lots of iterations and them telling us what they liked or didn't like until we finally were able to get to a design that worked for them, which is this here. So this is an example of a water temperature forecast that was made on October 13th in 2020. And on the right panel right here is what the water temperatures actually are. So on the left of this vertical line is the past. So what's the water temperature at every meter of the lake for the past week? And then to the right of that is what is the future? And we are only showing 3 different depths here because these are possible extraction treatment depths. So the forecast was made on October 13th, and it's showing you what over the next 16 days the water temperatures might be. On the left panel here is the fall turnover forecast. So on the x-axis again is time, showing you the past versus the future. And on the y-axis is the percent chance. So of all of the different model simulations we run, how many of them, or what percent, show that turnover is going to be happening into the future? So we're now able to make this into a likelihood that turnover is going to happen on a certain day. And so as you can see right here, in the next few days, it's unlikely to happen, 0% chance, but into the future, it's likely to happen over the next week or so. And so just to show you an example forecast, a recent forecast from July 15th, this is a forecast that was made at the reservoir for 1 meter's depth, just at the surface, water temperature on the y-axis, and time on the x-axis. We are running several hundred model simulations every single night. So we have a median prediction, which is the thick black line. And then we have 95% predictive intervals, which are the lighter black lines. Our goal is to try to get within those lighter black lines. And if you actually compare this forecast to what was observed, because that's been passed now, with those red dots right there, you can see that we did a pretty good job. So to answer our first question of how accurate are our forecasts, we have now been running this system since August 2018. And so over the past 3 years, almost 4 years, we can see that we are able to successfully predict water temperatures at both the surface of the lake as well as at the bottom of the lake very accurately into the future in both summer stratified conditions as well as in the fall mixing period. And if you aggregate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of forecasts, you can see that we're able to predict water temperature at all depths in the reservoir 16 days in advance within 0.25 degrees Celsius, which is really good. So here I'm showing you forecast minus observed. We want to be close to 0 as possible, which means that we actually forecasted the observations. This is days into the future, so from now into 16 days ahead. And at both 1 meters and 8 meters for this figure here, we are centered right around 0 right there. So in all, we can do a very good job and a very accurate job of forecasting temperature into the future. But can we actually forecast a discrete event? Like, can we actually forecast when turnover is going to happen? And so I'm going to show you forecast images that came from those daily emails that are stitched together as a video. And this is data from October 2018. This is a forecast that's starting on October 2nd. And I'm just going to give you the answer. The turnover happened that year on October 21, which is that red vertical line. And so as I click through these images, you're going to see that on October 2nd, there was a 0% chance, 16 days into the future, that there was going to be turnover happening. But as we get closer in time to October 21, that likelihood increases substantially. So we're now starting to see 2 weeks out, turnover likelihood is increasing. 1 week out, it's starting to increase quite a bit, centered around October 21. 5 days out, 4 days out, 3 days out, 2 days, nailed it. So in that year of October 2018, we were able to predict that turnover was going to happen on October 21, 8 days in advance. So here is the date of the forecast and the percent chance that turnover was going to happen on any of the other contender days. And on October 21, you can see that on October 13th, 8 days in advance, that we start to go over 50%, that that's the day, and it stays high through the rest of that period. So we were able to predict turnover the date of 8 days in advance in October 2018, in 2019, 4 days in advance, 13 days in advance in 2020, and 8 days in advance in 2021. And I want to share you this picture. Specifically, these are data from 2020, in which we were able to predict turnover almost 2 weeks in advance, the exact date. And so on the day in which that first forecast was made, in late October, the water column was really solidly, very strongly thermally stratified, where the surface water was 18 degrees Celsius, the bottom was 13. There's no way that managers way back in early, kind of mid-October, would have known that on November 2nd there was going to be a cold snap that was going to cause really early and kind of rapid mixing events to happen. To answer our third question, what we found was that the dominant source of uncertainty in our forecasts varied with whether or not we were forecasting the surface or the bottom of the reservoir. So at the bottom of the reservoir, which is at 8 meters depth here on the right panel, the dominant source of uncertainty in our forecast was driven predominantly by process, our model error, meaning that our models just weren't able to have a good representation at certain times of year in terms of being able to accurately forecast water temperature. But interestingly, at the surface of the reservoir, the dominant driver of uncertainty in our forecasts was meteorological driver data. So how good our weather forecasts were for the site actually controlled how accurate the water temperature forecasts were. Which makes sense, right? Because at the surface of the lake, you're much more sensitive to meteorological forcing than at the bottom of the lake. This is really important in terms of being able to identify how best to improve the system into the future. Okay, so to wrap up this first part of my talk with some take-homes, we were able to successfully forecast water temperature at all depths in both kind of mixed and stratified conditions, as well as being able to identify when turnover is going to happen 4 to 13 days in advance. And that 4 days minimum kind of lead time is really critical because our social scientists did a lot of interviews with our manager colleagues and found that that was the minimum amount of time that they needed to be able to make change. So with that 4-day advance warning, they're able to change staff schedules. They're able to order more chemicals for the treatment plant and have them actually arrive in time. They're able to have extra filters on hand to be able to anticipate and handle that increased iron that's going to be coming into their system. Importantly, the system that we have developed, which again we call FLAIR, which stands for Forecasting Lake and Reservoir Ecosystems, our software, has been completely designed with open source tools and software. And so we are currently in the process of scaling FLAIR from these initial reservoir deployments in Roanoke to many other lakes across the US. And as part of this, we're learning a lot about the predictability and how it varies on certain gradients, such as lake size and lake depth. And third, I think the understanding that uncertainty contribution is really critical. A more uncertain forecast is a less accurate forecast. So knowing how we can decrease the uncertainty will improve our accuracy. And so transitioning to this last part of my talk, can we use forecasting to both learn about reservoirs and ecosystem function, as well as to adaptively manage water quality? And there's something that I haven't told you yet, but this Pacific Reservoir, FCR, has an oxygenation system in it. And so this hypolimnic oxygenation system withdraws water from the bottom of the reservoir, a hypolimnion, that cold bottom layer onshore, where we inject supersaturated oxygen into it and then return that oxygenated water back into the bottom of the lake without altering water temperature or thermal stratification. This oxygenation system has been developed by a suite of engineers that we've worked with for a long time, the Western Virginia Water Authority. And it was originally deployed to control the release of all of that iron from those sediments into the water column. And when all of those pipes and nozzles are brought to the surface for maintenance, it looks like this, where we literally have hoses and kind of pipes throughout the reservoir. And this is just much of my life is spent plumbing, and this is a full kind of picture of it. So we know that we want to add in oxygen. Oxygen is good. It will control those fluxes of metals, of nitrogen, of phosphorus from the sediments into the water column. But a major question the managers want to know is how much oxygen, right? You don't want to add in too much. Too much oxygen could be bad. It will actually kill your fish if you have too much. It's also, there's cost associated with it. So you want to add in just the right amount of oxygen in terms of being able to manage your water quality, but not too much. So it would be super helpful if you knew ahead of time what next week's conditions are going to be or their oxygen demand, and then preemptively add in just enough oxygen to avoid those low oxygen or anoxic conditions in the lake. And so the question that our team is really excited about working on now is, can we use management scenario forecasts to manage water quality? And so I'm just going to show you kind of a quick highlight from some of this work. But our team has now been developing oxygenation scenarios which are fed into our forecasts. So we can give the managers information about what if they made this decision today, and what would that look like for the next several weeks. And so on this panel on the left here is dissolved oxygen at the surface of the reservoir. Oxygen is on the y-axis here. This is a forecast that was made last summer on August 15th at a time in which the oxygenation system was off. So there was already very low oxygen at the bottom of the reservoir. It was strongly stratified. The blue line here is what happens if on August 15th, the managers turned on the oxygenation system at the highest level possible and left it on for the next 2 weeks. And the black line here is what if we just kept the oxygen system off? So these are two very different scenarios. And what you can see is that for the panel on the left, that there's actually no difference into the future between if the oxygenation system is on or off, which makes sense because this is at the surface of the reservoir. The reservoir is really strongly thermally stratified, so anything that's happening at the bottom waters because of the oxygenation system won't affect what's happening at the air-water surface. But where I think it's really interesting is the panel on the right, where you can see that if the oxygenation system stays off, oxygen stays very, very low into the future. In contrast, if we turn the oxygenation system on, we see an immediate increase of oxygen concentrations, which start to increase and get really high up to 2 weeks in advance. Here we're running 400 separate model simulations for each of these different scenarios. So the median dark kind of thick line here is the median of all those different simulations, and the hashed lines here are the 95% predictive intervals. So this is just important information for understanding what target the managers want for oxygen next week, and then they know how much oxygen to add in. So this is just the oxygen concentrations, but because of the model that we work with, where we can simulate a whole suite of different water quality metrics, we can actually look at a bunch of different variables. And what you see here is that we can start to predict the future water quality of the reservoir based off of today's decision making. So on the left panel is methane concentrations in the bottom of the reservoir at 8 meters. If the oxygen system stays off, you can see that we're starting to increase the accumulation of methane into the future. So we essentially have low oxygen water where high quantities of methane are being produced. Versus if oxygen is turned on, we're starting to oxidize methane, and methane actually starts to go down. This matters a lot as we're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, because reservoirs are a really important source of greenhouse gases such as methane and CO2 to the atmosphere. On the right is ammonium, NH4, which is a limiting nutrient for algae in our reservoir. And what you can see is that if the oxygen stays off, we have a release of ammonium into the water column, which starts to go up, versus it stays at steady state if we can turn on the oxygen system. So again, this is providing both important information for both water quality management, as well as providing a check on us for understanding how the ecosystem works. And this is constantly being updated as we collect new data every single day. And so I just want to show you the power of this approach. These are our methane emission forecasts that were developed by Ryan McClure, which is a recent PhD grad from my lab. And he developed methane efflux forecasts for this specific reservoir into the future. And these forecasts were developed for 1 and 2 weeks ahead. And part of why we did this is because methane is really patchy. There can sometimes be really high release, but you would never know if you weren't sampling for it. And so having these forecasts allowed us to know when we needed to hightail it to the reservoir to go sample. So in this, the blue are the observations. We've got time here from June to November. Methane efflux is on the y-axis here. And I'm going to show you the forecasts, which are going to be in gray, 1 week ahead of time. And so you can see that the blue observations are following exactly as we forecasted them to be throughout the summer season from June to November. And importantly, we were able to capture this high spike that happened in July. This is just one variable, but I think it demonstrates the power of this approach for thinking about management. Okay, so to wrap this all together, hopefully I've convinced you, or at least excited you, about the potential of forecasting as a management approach. It is not trivial to deploy one of these systems in a reservoir. This took many, many years, a lot of collaboration, a lot of funding to be able to support the development. We're now at the point where we're starting to scale to other systems, but I think that there's tremendous promise for thinking about opportunities here using this combination of sensors, data, models, and cyber infrastructure for helping water quality. I'm really excited about this as both a scientist as well as someone that's very deeply committed to improving lake management. There's some really fundamental science questions that we are starting to answer, which are enabled uniquely by using forecasting. I'm specifically interested in thinking about when our forecasts do well and when do they fail. Why? Is that something that's related to time of year or to the models we're using? How does our accuracy of our forecasts vary among different water quality metrics? I think this is really important work that's getting at kind of fundamentally the predictability of nature. And then finally, I think, in terms of this audience here today, we are all committed to trying to improve water quality. I think forecasting has tremendous potential for both advancing our basic science aims as well as our management aims. Because going into the future, our ecosystems are only going to become increasingly variable, and so it's vitally important that we understand as well as forecast how they will respond. And so with that, I would like to thank my colleagues again and my lab members. The Western Virginia Water Authority has been a tremendous partner in this work and supporting the science. The National Science Foundation has supported the development of this forecasting system, and I would love to answer your questions. Thank you.
All right, who has questions? Anyone?
So obviously, as a GLEON site, you guys have a lot of sensors, an excessively large amounts of sensors maybe. As you've been scaling them to other places, have you been able to sort of see what the minimum amount of sensors to be able to make this work has been?
Yes, that's an excellent question. For those in the back, the question was, do you really need all those sensors or not for getting accurate forecasts? And I actually have a PhD student that's working on this question right now. So there's a reservoir upstream of Falling Creek called Beaver Dam Reservoir that has no electricity. And we have been using, we've deployed sensors out there, and we've been doing experiments where what if we take data away from our forecast to see how the accuracy changes. And what we've found is that for at least that specific system, which is very similar to Falling Creek, we need a minimum of weekly data to get more, still I would say reasonably accurate forecasts. Obviously they're not as good as if you had daily data that is streaming, but weekly data seems to be able to still give you accurate forecasts for water temperature.
But still for every single depth level and all of the different kinds?
So for this specifically was for water temperature forecasts, and for that what Heather was doing was she was taking just a handheld YSI and surface 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, kind of standard. We tried to emulate like what a standard water monitoring protocol would be from the top to the bottom. So yeah, it's not, those data are not streaming. It's kind of still hand recorded and writing down and transcribing. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you for the great presentation, which really goes to decision makers. And in terms of developing your forecasting, you mentioned having concerns on iron, especially in reservoirs. What are the other heavy metals that you do have concerns in Virginia when you talk about heavy metals? Thank you.
So the question was as to which metals are we trying to or monitor for specifically?
What other heavy metals,
heavy metals
do you have concerns around the quality in Virginia?
So I would say my expertise is limited to the Roanoke Reservoir, so I don't feel comfortable answering that question for other parts of the state. But for the reservoirs around Roanoke, the things that we're monitoring for most as probably the problems are iron and manganese. In terms of, these are the kind of the two by far concerns that the managers have for drinking water, kind of thresholds that we are routinely exceeding, and that's a lot due to the geology of the area. One of the towns that is just outside a reservoir is called Ironto, which if you write that out, is Iron Town. And that's because there actually were mines in the area for that. So there are likely other metals. We've done sweeps of other elements, and iron dominates concentrations. If there's no oxygen being pumped in, over 20 milligrams per liter, so very high. Again, I know that there's other metal problems in other parts of the state, but I feel like my expertise is just on the Roanoke ones. So.
Not in Virginia, so. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentation. I have two questions. One is with this bipartisan infrastructure law, over $50 billion is being allocated to the Water Office of EPA. So my first question is, when will this system be ready to be sold to a municipality? And the second question is, you indicated that that reservoir is not being dredged in over 124 years. Is any data that you're taking now indicating that it should be dredged to increase water quality? So those are two questions. When it will be ready to be sold, and the other about dredging. Thank you.
So the questions were, should we dredge the reservoir to improve water quality? And the second is how do we commercialize the system? I'm going to answer the easier one first, which is the dredging question. And so from my experience, we have done sediment cores. We have done actually sonar to understand like where the sediment has accumulated in the reservoir. It is definitely accumulated, and it's the source of a lot of the water quality problems we have now. I think it's an actually really interesting experiment because it hasn't been dredged for so long that it's still having an effect 130 years later, I think is notable. And I think that speaks to if it was dredged, it likely would improve water quality in the system. However, there's also a lot of other problems with dredging, and who knows what we would be bringing up to the surface as part of that dredging. My experience from growing up on the Hudson River during the dredging there is that there's a lot of unintended consequences, so I think dredging is not something that we should be entering into lightly. That's just my personal opinion. In terms of other metals or other kind of byproducts that might be at the bottom. The second question was regarding commercialization, and I think that's a really important question in that we really, our team of researchers that put this together at the core, want this to be broadly used. I don't want to be creating technology that other people have to pay for to help their drinking water. I think that this is not a system that right now is ready to be deployed out of the box for your lake, for example, because you need the human infrastructure of us to basically set it up for you. I think that is a limitation right now. I think if there were the right people and the funds and resources available, it can be scaled, and this is something that we're actively working on right now. It's a really important question. We've been in discussions with other water utilities about what we can do and what we can help with them, and honestly, the limitation right now is just there is not enough of me and my colleagues to be able to kind of get this up and running, and our students.
Thank you.
But I'm hopeful that we can get there. So give me a few years.
Yes.
Thank you.